Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CJCA and Center for Coordinated Assistance to State Staff Recruitment and Retention webinar. My name is Wendy Faulkner, and I am the Assistant Executive Director of the Council of Juvenile Correctional Administrators. I'd like to thank all of you for taking time to register for today's webinar and taking time out of your busy schedules to focus on this important issue and working to improve the conditions of confinement, and most importantly, working to improve long-term outcomes for youth entrusted to our care. Today's webinar will provide an overview of staff retention strategies and facility culture. For those of you who might be new to CJCA, we are a national nonprofit organization formed in 1994 to improve juvenile justice systems, local secure correctional and residential facilities, services, programs, and long-term outcomes for youth and their families. CJCA represents the juvenile justice system CEOs in all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and various metropolitan counties across the country. This program is made possible through funding from the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Justice Programs, Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Through this grant opportunity, the American Institutes for Research, the Council of Juvenile Correctional Administrators, and Georgetown University McCourt School of Public Policy's Center for Juvenile Justice Reform have partnered to form the Center for Coordinated Assistance to States, otherwise known as CCAS. Next slide. CCAS coordinates the delivery of training and technical assistance to states, communities, territories, and tribal units looking to improve outcomes for at-risk youth and youth involved in the juvenile justice and child welfare systems. The focus of the center is to provide ongoing training and technical assistance to achieve individual and organizational changes that support positive impact on the juvenile justice system. Next slide, please. On the call today is Sharon Pett, who is the project manager for the staff recruitment and retention cohort. We also have Darlene Conroy and Jonah Shenham, who are helping with the technical aspects of this program from the CJCA office in Braintree, Massachusetts. I would like to give special thanks to Sharon, who has put a great deal of work into the preparation of this webinar, as well as our presenters for today. Margaret Chow-Menzer, Deputy Commissioner of Administration and Finance with the Massachusetts Department of Youth Services, and Stephen Jett, Director of Southwest Idaho Juvenile Detention Center. At this point, I'm going to ask Jonah to provide us with a few technical instructions before we start. Jonah?
Thank you, Wendy. Just a few quick notes before we get going here. All attendees will be muted for the duration of this webinar. If you have any questions, please type them into the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. If we have time at the end of today's webinar, we will try to do a short Q&A, but in the event that we don't have time, we will follow up directly with everybody who asks questions following the close of the webinar. After this webinar concludes, we will send out a video recording and the PowerPoint presentation to all attendees. And now I will turn it over to Sharon to get us going. Sharon?
Great, thank you, Jonah. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Sharon Pett, the project manager for the Staff Recruitment and Retention Technical and Training Assistance cohort. I just want to welcome everyone again, and I'm really looking forward to sharing some information related to facility and agency culture and the impact that that has on staff turnover. So here's what we're hoping to accomplish today. We have a lot of information to provide. Hopefully we'll get through all of it. You all can read these, but I want to highlight that one of our goals today is really to share what the research says about agency and facility culture, including those factors that have the greatest influence on staff retention. And probably most importantly is that you'll be hearing from the practitioners in the field about specific strategies that they've used to successfully retain staff. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I want to start by talking about what we mean by a healthy culture and briefly describe the factors that contribute to an agency and or facility success. So here are some common characteristics of successful organizations. So organizations that thrive tend to have a close alignment between the agency's mission and its management practices. They have solid communication at all levels. So that's within the leadership team as well as between management and direct care staff. Which includes setting clear expectations for staff. Most successful organizations provide staff with opportunities for professional growth and development, and this is of particular importance in terms of the generational differences with regard to the millennials. Their employees are involved in decision-making or building pieces of the program, and healthy organizations recognize staff for their contributions and have supervisors who express genuine care and concern for staff. And there's also a sense of family and professional pride, and kind of a culture of teamwork, if you will. Next slide, please. So one of the most critical indicators of a healthy environment or a healthy culture is staff engagement. So this graph here on the screen, you can go ahead and click again, Jonah. This graph was taken from John Bernard's book, Business at the Speed of Now. These data were taken from the Gallup Consulting Organization, and what they found was that the number one difference between the most successful companies, so those in the top quartile as rated by their employees, when compared with those in the lower quartile, was the degree of staff engagement. And so what this chart is telling us is that 67% or 2/3 of the typical workforce is not engaged. So of this 67%, of the 100%, 49% are not engaged. These are the folks that basically just show up to work. They do what they're supposed to be doing. They follow orders, but they kind of keep quiet. And then we have another 18%, the top pie portion there, that are actively attempting to sabotage the agency's goals or performance. So why do we care whether or not staff are engaged? So here are some of the negative results that occur when staff are not engaged. Obviously, high rates of absenteeism. So when staff don't show up to work, there's not only the typical logistical problems that result, because obviously we were working in juvenile justice facilities for the most part, and we have posted positions, right? So those are mandatory posts. So we have the issue of not only filling those posts, but the secondary impact is a loss of trust between staff and youth. So if a staff member is repeatedly not showing up for their shift, it tends to send a message to other staff members that they're not really committed to the team. And then as well as it sends a message to youth that, they aren't really invested in the youth's positive growth, so that they don't really care. So this is obviously counterproductive and is not going to get us the outcomes that we want for the youth we serve. So high staff turnover is also one of the negative consequences that results from, this lack of engagement. So obviously we all know that staff turnover costs us a lot of money because we know that onboarding staff members, in terms of just even the training alone, new uniforms and those sorts of things can get pretty costly. And so staff turnover is obviously one of the major impacts of the disengagement. And then other impacts are an increase to incidents, decrease in youth and family satisfaction, decreased productivity. And so what the research is telling us is that increasing staff engagement is a critical component to influencing staff retention and our success in terms of achieving our mission. Next slide, please. So I wanted to remind everyone, and I know you've heard this on previous webinars, but I wanted to remind folks that one of the major factors in agency success is leadership. And so this includes both formal and informal leaders. So because we know that effective leadership is one of the driving factors to success, agency and facilities leaders really must make sure that we are not committing these 7 deadly sins shown on the screen here. So the right-hand column, it's titled waste. And basically, this is the impact that that particular sin has on staff and the agency or facility work environment. So folks can go ahead and read these, but the thing to keep in mind is that when we're developing strategies to address staff turnover and improve staff retention, we really need to be asking ourselves if we're making these mistakes or sins. And if we are committing these management sins, we really need to develop specific strategies to address these flaws, so to speak. So I want to point out that one of the most significant sins here is staff not having the tools or the skills they need to be competent and confident in the work that they do. That's that last row there. The ultimate result is mission failure. And so what the research literature tells us is that when people don't feel equipped to effectively handle youth, they feel unsafe, and this often leads to an increase in incidents. And ultimately, we know that fear for safety is one of the reasons that staff choose to leave this line of work, particularly in a facility environment. And so training and ongoing coaching and support really are paramount to particularly in the first 6 months to a year of hire. Next slide, please. And so as I mentioned, the body of workforce development research tells us that agency and facility work environments have a tremendous impact on job satisfaction and staff retention. So our ultimate goal really is to establish and maintain a collaborative, caring, and stable work environment that supports creativity. So without these elements, agencies are going to continue to experience high staff turnover. So it's important for us to understand that since culture is the bedrock for any initiative success, agencies really must free up some resources and devote the resources necessary to effectively shift the culture. Because shifting culture, as we know, it includes changing folks' perspective, but through sharing information, training, modeling, and so on. Next slide, please. So here are some additional characteristics of a healthy organization or culture. Respectful communication between coworkers and between staff and youth. Consistent follow-through by agency leadership. And this means if staff have a concern, then leaders address the concern in a timely manner. They reach back out to the staff member to ensure the concern has been resolved to their satisfaction. So follow-through can also be leaders reaching out to staff following a serious incident, such as a youth on staff assault, which sends a message of care and concern. So a healthy work environment, a healthy culture also involves leaders who consistently model expectations. So this is that idea of being the change you want to see. And a healthy work environment is also one in which the leaders are open and transparent. So they are visible and can be seen regularly interacting with direct care staff and youth. So next slide, please. So the challenge for agencies really is not the will to change, but rather the how to change the culture. So first and foremost, changing culture takes patience and persistence. We all know, again, that this doesn't happen overnight, and so it's going to be important that with any initiative that leaders be ready to endure any bumps along the way, including staff resistance. So one of the best phrases I've ever heard is persistence beats resistance. And patience is absolutely key here because we're trying to change the work environment, which includes changing people's mindsets, which takes time. So some of the things to keep in mind when you're working to change culture are it's important really to help staff understand why the change is important and the positive impact the change is going to have. So it's critical to have open and frequent communication with staff at all levels. And this communication really should be in a variety of formats to account for different learning styles. Something else to keep in mind is that staff need to know how their daily work contributes to the agency's overall mission and purpose. So we really need to connect the dots for staff and help them understand how their daily interactions with youth and the other job duties are critical pieces to us fulfilling our agency's mission. And leaders at all levels need to walk the talk and need to role model respect and transparency. Next slide, please. So we're kind of breezing through this information. Obviously, there's a whole body of literature out there that talks about culture change and the science of implementation and so forth. So I encourage folks to kind of take a look at that. But just trying to set the context for our practitioners to help us understand when we go to move into the lessons learned bit. So by way of summary, just really quickly here, highlighting some of the pieces, it's really important for leaders, again, to be open and transparent, lead by example. You want to be visible. The facility and agency leaders want to be visible in the facility, want to see them interacting with direct care staff, giving positive feedback, and also want to be willing to make mistakes and admit when you make them. The need to over-communicate, sharing information, as I mentioned before, just in a variety of formats and forums, such as newsletters, all staff meetings, focus groups, any way you can get the information out there. And you want to make sure that you let folks know where the agency is heading, the benefits of moving in this direction, what the plan is for moving in that direction, and provide some progress reports, if you will, about where we're at in implementing those identified strategies. So again, open communication is really critical. Workforce development research also tells us the importance, again, about involving staff in the decision-making process. So giving staff a voice and asking them for their ideas and their solutions, and then implementing some of those solutions and then looping back around and letting them know that we implemented some of their solutions. And of course, we need to support staff through coaching and ongoing supervision. There's a lot of research out there that says the most critical period for retaining staff is within the first 3 to 6 months. And so providing that coaching, within the first year really is really critical. Next slide, please. So I want to mention briefly before I hand the floor over to our next panelist, the importance of using data as a tool to influence culture change. folks can certainly take a look at the CJCA Staff Recruitment, Hiring, and Retention Toolkit to get additional information. But I want to just remind folks that data really can be a powerful tool to help us identify the root causes that may be contributing to high staff turnover. Data can also help us track whether or not a solution or strategy that we've decided to implement is actually working. So here are some assessments for agencies and facilities to consider when they're more closely examining their work environment. So the first is an organizational assessment, readiness for change assessment. This type of assessment really does provide valuable information around the degree or level of readiness for large-scale change. So a readiness assessment helps us determine if our agency has the infrastructure to support and sustain change over time. So do we have the pieces in place that are going to allow us to be successful? The second one up there is culture climate surveys. So these are usually done annually, but essentially these are an attempt to gather information about whether staff understand what the agency is trying to achieve, like what is the agency's mission. So some other things it measures, do staff trust and respect leadership? Do staff feel they have the tools to effectively do their job? Do staff feel safe, and so on? The third one up there, staff stay surveys, interviews, and focus groups. These really do allow us to gather real-time data about the work environment. So stay interviews and focus groups are really good tools to gather ideas not only about how folks, their perception of the work environment, but also some ideas about or solutions about ways to increase morale and decrease staff turnover. OYA quarterly conversations. So the Oregon Youth Authority has designated staff conduct what they call quarterly conversations to gather information about the work environment. So they use a series of structured questions and have designated staff who go out and to each of the facilities and talk with staff and youth about the organization and the facility performance. And they focus on 5 specific domains. It's safety and security, caring and supportive relationships, high expectations and accountability, meaningful participation, and community connection. So these quarterly conversations really allow team members to identify areas of success, what priorities they should have, and then strategies for improvement. And then the final, of course, our traditional up there is the exit surveys and interviews. So the important takeaway or message I want to reinforce is that agencies and facilities really should be considering using data to help identify the root causes of issues in the work environment, and then also to help us identify whether or not solutions that we've implemented are actually working. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'd like to hand the floor over now to Margaret Chow-Menzer, who is going to share with us some of the strategies that the Massachusetts Department of Youth Services has used related to culture and staff retention. Margaret, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I think, Sharon, you put in sort of the right framework in terms of, what are the different variables and factors that we want to consider in terms of, getting the right kind of staff recruited and retained to work in the system. And what we try to do here in Massachusetts is really think about our mission and sort of the framework in which we want these employees to be thinking about in terms of their work with us. And it starts off with sort of the positive youth development framework, which is really important. One of the challenges in terms of sort of making sure we have the right staff is how do you identify sort of who are the right people that would be working with the young folks that we serve. And so in the context of, recruitment in the first instance and PYD, I think it's important to distinguish the work that we do in the juvenile justice system versus those who work in the adult correction system, because that's always a challenge. People that we talk to oftentimes don't have an idea in terms of what is the work that we're asking them to do. And so one of the really key criteria that we look for in people that we're looking to recruit into this work is, do they really care about the young people? Do they enjoy working with young people? That is so critical. It is not just a job, because they have to understand that they're being hired to be a role model, and that they're there to really be supportive and build that kind of trusting adult relationship that is so key to being successful in working with our young people. And so I'll go through the various slides in terms of how we go about applying this. So next slide. What we did back in 2015 is we said,
we saw, as we were looking at our metrics, that our turnover rate was horrendous back in 2014, 2015. It was running about 40%, which is ridiculous in the sense that it is very challenging to have good programming for young people when there's not stability in the workforce. I think that's kind of obvious for most people, but it certainly is true because the staff that work on the floor have to work as a team, and they need to understand sort of how each of them play a role in that team in supporting the young people. So knowing that we had such a high turnover rate, we engaged a management, HR management consulting firm to work with us and really put together focus groups and surveys of our floor staff to really ascertain, you know, like what are the challenges in the work? What do you think are the ideal characteristics of someone working in this field? And what are the things that, you know, the department can do to really improve on recruitment of the appropriate staff and how we can better retain them? So some of the comments that we got back from the focus groups and the surveys were, one, it would be helpful in terms of working with these young people to have staff who have similar experiences growing up that they can relate to. That was one important thing. Secondly, important that they really care about the young person and that they can show great character in terms of being fair in treating the young person in the program. They have to have the ability to relate to the young person, be able to talk to them, engage them, and basically build that trusting relationship, which is so key to running a good quality, safe program. Common sense, that's often a tough characteristic to find in many people, but that would be important as well. Next slide. So we asked about sort of, well, what are the factors in terms of interviewing and hiring? It was clear in talking to our staff through this focus group and survey process that when we're trying to attract the right people into the job, again, when I said before, you know, working in the juvenile justice system, the most people in the public don't really understand what that is. And some of them think it's really more of a correctional type of job, which it is not. And so one of the things that was brought forward during these sessions was the need to have a more realistic preview for job applicants in terms of what is it like to be working in the juvenile justice system in a setting where there's locked doors. We had learned in terms of talking to some of the applicants for the job that it is a startling experience in terms of going into a facility and hearing doors locked as you go through different hallways and into different rooms. So it was really important in order to attract the right people to create a way of giving applicants a realistic preview, which we have done in the sense that for new or for individuals who are applying for jobs, we now have arranged for them to have actual tours of our facilities so that they can actually see what a facility looks like and observe what the staff actually are asked to do in those settings. We thought, based on this, our basic training in terms of our what we offer in our training academy. So there were comments about, yes, we provide to staff many of the important content area about working with young people, but we were informed that it didn't necessarily translate into some of the volatility that could occur in those settings. So that was something else that we had to rethink in terms of the basic training that we were providing to new employees. Next slide. We also had suggestions around onboarding and retention. And in Massachusetts, we have what we call a continuum of services. So young people go from being in treatment programs, which are in secure facilities, and then also going into the community. And the treatment programs, there's like step downs in terms of as they progress in their treatment. And what was really important was that there is a need for consistency in terms of the operations, how policies and procedures are followed and implemented, and important in terms of making sure that all staff understand that we are one system. So that was one comment that we heard. Another was that making sure staff understand that what an important role they play in terms of the impact and effect they will have on the young people's lives, because they're going to be spending many days with the young person, and what they say, what they do is going to be really important in terms of how young people model and think about adults. There was also comments about the need for more on-the-job onboarding experience and less classroom time. So we took all that into consideration, including questions about how can we do a better job in retaining our staff, many of which I think Sharon had gone over in her earlier slide, which is really talking about giving more respect to employees, acknowledging the work that they do, having a safe environment for which they are working in, providing the necessary support for them to do their job and do it well, providing the appropriate coaching and supervision that will help them and give them the skills and the tools to do their job well, and fairness in terms of how staff are treated, in terms of both rewards as well as in terms of accountability. So, sorry, next slide, 2 slides down, sorry. Next slide. So with our basic training, as we heard from our staff through these focus groups and surveys, we recognize that our method of training delivery, which was basically 3 consecutive weeks of basic training that covered many, many topics, which we thought were really, really important for the staff to have to understand the population that they're working with, how, adolescent brain development is an important variable for our staff to understand, how to understand how trauma impacts the way young people react in terms of their impulsivity. Also talking about other important safety areas in terms of PREA, suicide awareness, how to address young people in terms of first trying, who are in crisis or misbehaving, going with the defensive disengagement and diffusing technique before going to restraint, and then covering many other areas, if you can see in this slide and the next slide, which talks about different topics that are covered in basic training. But we heard loud and clear from staff, which is you are providing a lot of content in a very short period of time, and then asking us to go on to the units in the floor and do the work. And it's just a lot to digest. So a year and a half ago, we revamped how we delivered training. So the change now is that for the 3 weeks training, we have now created a curriculum where the first week of training would be those basic topics related to the operations of the unit, including searches and restraint, other things that staff would need in order to be able to work the floor. So prior to going to the unit and working the floors, they would get that first week of training. Then after that, they would go back to the unit and begin to apply some of the things that they learned, be able to observe more in terms of what goes on in the unit, get some of the coaching and on-the-job training. And then what we've said is for the remaining 2 weeks of training content, they're given up to 90 days to complete. So what this attempts to do is to strike a balance in terms of giving the necessary content for the new staff to do their job, get them a sense of being more familiar with the work before then delivering the additional content to them. And since we've implemented this new schedule, we've gotten very good feedback from new staff who feel as if this is a good balance in terms of getting the information to help them understand the work, but also giving them the opportunity to really work the floors in order to be able to apply what they're learning. Next slide. So in addition to the basic training in Massachusetts, we also require floor staff to go through what we call annual review training, and that really is to ensure that we reinforce to them some of the very basic principles and values that are important in terms of them doing the work, and some of the sort of basic procedures that we want to make sure there is fidelity in terms of them about, following the policy and procedures of the agency. Next slide. So culture of inclusion. So we've implemented several vehicles by which we try to be more inclusive in terms of having staff input in terms of what they know about what's going on in the agency, and getting their feedback about major policy or initiatives that the agency is contemplating. So we've implemented staff meetings. We require that all parts of our agency, depending on the particular program unit or the particular facility unit, that they have weekly or monthly meetings, which are so important just to keep staff informed about what's going on. Similarly, we've started our bi-monthly newsletters, which is really to highlight sort of what's going on in the agency, highlight staff that we want everyone to know the great work that they're doing. That's been really well received. We have now made it a formal regular process or a regular event in our agency, which is having summits. One, which is we call our residential summit. These are all annual summits where we have staff from all our residential programs, both in terms of the state-operated programs and provider-operated programs, meet once a year, where we have different topics that are relevant and perhaps new initiatives that are going on that we want to make sure staff are aware of, and also get their input in terms of how best to improve or implement what we're proposing. Similarly, we do that with our caseworkers and our clinical staff as well. We have here in Massachusetts our safety committee, which is a committee that was established probably 6-7 years ago. We have representation on the committee from all walks of our service system, from senior leaders to actually group workers, and we meet every 6 to 8 weeks. And the focus really is on safety. We talk about how we can improve safety in our facilities. We have metrics that we track and talk about how we can improve. So at the safety committee, we look at by program sort of incidents of assaults. We look at incidents of restraint, use of restraints, incidents of use of room confinement. And we look at any trends and patterns and talk about sort of what we should do or could do to improve on what we're seeing in terms of the data. I mean, one of the byproducts of the discussion around assault was looking at, when do assaults occur? Are assault, and when we say assaults, these are both assaults in terms of youth on staff and youth on youth. And so we asked the question, time of day of the week, is it one youth, one time, or are there certain youth that seem to engage in this behavior more than others? And as I said, one of the byproducts of this review of data was a study that we just recently completed, what we call our post-assault study, which looks at what is triggering young people to engage in assaultive behavior. And so be more than happy to talk about that at another time, but very interesting findings that we're hoping we'll be able to come up with some strategies on how to address those triggers that's causing these assaultive behaviors. We also have our policy steering committee, and so whenever the department is thinking about promulgating a new policy or modifying a new policy, We have a steering committee that convenes every 4 to 8 weeks. It is open to any staff member who might be interested in the particular subject matter that's being covered by a policy. And it's been very effective in terms of a lot of give and take. One of our most recent policy revision had to do with unit disturbance, which is something that our floor staff are very concerned about and really had some excellent input in terms of helping us shape that particular policy. We also have our workforce planning and development work group. Again, it's a work group that meets every 4 to 6 weeks. There is a broad representation. We have many of our human resources staff participate in that, but we also have training staff. We have invited our recreational coordinators to participate in that work group. And within that work group, we have sort of different areas that we want to focus on, including we have a subcommittee that is known as our branding committee. Again, that goes back to the study or the focus group that we did back in 2015, which is how do we do a better job in communicating not only to our staff and the young people, but to the general public, what is the work of our floor staff? What is it that, what is it, how can we do a better job explaining the work that they do? And so the branding committee has worked on first suggesting that we change the functional title of our floor staff. It has been for eons. They were known as group youth workers, and they communicated to us, which we thought made sense, that it's such a plain vanilla name that it really doesn't convey what it is that we're asking our staff to do. Some people think that they work in a summer camp or daycare. So we just have completed our discussion with our labor unions about changing the functional title of this group of workers, and so we're changing them from group youth workers to juvenile justice youth development specialists. We think that that was really, even though it's a mouthful, I think it's much more descriptive, and it really acknowledges the really special work that we're asking this group of people to do. So we think branding was important. We're in the process of trying to develop a video that will explain to the public sort of what it is we do and what are we asking our staff to do. So that was really important. It really reinforces to our staff that we really think it's important, the work that they do, and that we need to do a better job in explaining to everybody what that is. We also have equity and fairness work group, and that is something that we initiated a year ago, and it really goes to the whole question about, is there fairness in terms of the promotional opportunities available to our staff? If we look at the demographic of our workforce, we see that for those who are working in our facilities on the floor, we have, I think, about 60% are individuals of color. But when you get to the really leadership portion of our organization, it is primarily white. And so, again, we think it's important to really look at how do we, what is our workforce and what do we do in order to make sure that there's fairness and opportunity for growth for our workforce. And that's something that the Equity and Fairness Group are working on. We do also conduct stay and exit survey, and we're also doing strategic planning. And what we try to do with all these different work groups is to be more inclusive and use it as an opportunity for individuals who work for us who don't always have the chance to really participate in these groups and really have an impact in terms of helping us steer sort of the direction in which the agency is going. And I think by having that kind of inclusiveness, it also gives the staff people the exposure to leaders within the organization so that when there are promotional opportunities, they are someone that people are aware of and I think it really helps in terms of what we're trying to do in terms of promotion and succession planning. Next slide. So working together with labor unions, that's really, really important for us because our, except for managers, all our staff are members of a collective bargaining unit. And so for quite a while, ASME, which is the union that represents our floor staff in our facilities, they have been really concerned about safety and the perception that, there is assaults that are occurring that should not occur. And we cannot disagree that, we need to do our best to try and reduce the incident of assaults in our units. So one of the things that we were able to work out with the union was to enter into an MOU where we acknowledge that, in fact, there may be certain assaultive incidents that are so serious that the employee really wants to press criminal charges against the youth. And so we set forth an MOU where we made it really clear that we have different venues to support staff who have been assaulted, and that includes providing employee assistance for them, as well as we have an internal process where a staff person who has been assaulted could be part of the process of determining what type of consequence there should be for the young person who engaged in that kind of behavior. But in addition to that, the union made it clear that some staff really wanted to be able to file criminal complaints. So we have worked out with all the district attorneys' offices throughout our state where, in fact, should a staff person want to file a complaint, we've got the system and process in place to support that person to do so. And I think that's made a big difference for the union and some of the members as well. We have had maybe a handful of incidents where staff have, in fact, indicated that they wanted to press charges, so we have worked with them to work with the law enforcement side to have that process go forward. We also, about a year and a half ago, established a safety task force. Again, this was a genesis that resulted from the union for many years had tried to pass legislation to create a commission to look at those policy and procedures that our department had in terms of what they believe really reduced safety in our units. Basically, I think one of the things that were concerning for some of the union members was our involuntary room confinement policy, which they thought, because it was clearly stated that it could not be used for punitive purposes, they thought it was an important tool that was being taken away from them, and therefore was making it harder in terms of maintaining the safety and security in our program. And so as a result, they wanted a commission to look at that and to be able to evaluate and direct the agency in terms of how we can do better in terms of protecting staff from these assaultive behaviors, as well as youth. That particular legislation never passed, but our agency decided that it made sense to have an independent body look at this question and try and put it to rest in the sense of come up with proposals in terms of how we can improve safety. And that work of the safety task force was completed about 8 months ago, and there were several recommendations that came out of that particular task force that the agency is currently implementing. But again, it's another collaboration with our unions, because they were the driving force and they had members sitting on this task force. We also had legislators as well as leaders from our sister agencies participate in this task force. And this was an opportunity where we had one session where some of our staff were asked by the union to come and speak to the task force. These were individuals who were the victim of assault in the program, and many of them, even though they were severely hurt, acknowledged that, in fact, they understood the whole thinking behind the developing brains of adolescents and the impulsivity, and therefore, even though many of them felt like they had the opportunity to file a criminal complaint, they elected not to. Okay, so the next slide. And this is the one where I talk about sort of changing the title and the job specification for our group workers. Again, we changed the title, but we also, what we did was in the particular standard job classification for this series of group workers, we emphasize more their role as advocates and supporting the educational, vocational, career sort of goals of the young people. I mean, they still have a responsibility for safety and security in the program, but we wanted to sort of shift sort of the emphasis more in terms of they are really our youth development specialists. They are there to really work with the young people and to help them change their trajectory in terms of their life outcomes. Next slide. So health and wellness, there's several things that we have put in place. One I spoke about in terms of employee assistance program. We also have a unit where we call employee services support, and that really is to reach out to our staff who may have been involved in some traumatic experience on the floor, and make sure that they're okay and give them the necessary resources and referrals. That would be helpful. We also have what we call dialectical behavioral therapy. That is a behavior management regime that is used for young people in our program, but we're also asking staff to really help the young person understand it, use it, and apply it, and have found that the staff themselves have been using the different techniques that are taught through DBT, and these things include sort of understanding sort of self-regulation skills, which is really important. Helping young people understand, maybe you could take a deep breath, count to whatever, step back, and staff have found that, they are oftentimes in very stressful situations as well, and applying some of these skills have helped them. So you include looking at not only self-regulation skills, but just focusing on themselves first before reacting to a particular stressful situation, teaching them how to assess the situations to make sure that they are safe and the youth are safe. And so through the staff being asked to apply these techniques with the youth, but also to co-facilitate and co-lead group therapy sessions with the youth in terms of how to understand these different techniques and to apply these techniques, I think that has been, from what we've heard from staff, very helpful for them in terms of how they manage the stress while they're at the facility. Lastly, we've been really fortunate that Kripalu Rise, which is a nonprofit organization up in the western part of our state, has offered scholarships and are having our staff go to a 5-day retreat at their facility where staff again learn to practice some of the DBT skills, as well as, in addition to that, yoga, self-care, and nutrition, which is really important. And our feedback from our staff is it is something that, if you can imagine, particularly some of the men who were like not very convinced that this was going to be helpful, that they're not into doing yoga, that's just not their thing. But interesting enough, when they came back, they were all so positive, and they were reporting that they continue to use many of these techniques in their day-to-day lives. So I think that's really something else that we're trying to explore in terms of making it available to other staff as well. Next slide. So going back to, again, the 2015 focus group and surveys, another thing that we heard from that series of sessions is that the job that we've been asking the staff to do is a very stressful job. And many of them feel like they get burnt out, that because of the 40% turnover rate, we have a lot of forced overtime. And so we said, okay, you know, it sounds like this is a real issue. So we were able to engage a number of graduates from the Harvard Kennedy School to do a study looking at our detention program and telling us, okay, are our staff asked to do too many things, and do they have enough time during their workday to really build trusting relationship with our young people? Because that's really what we want them to do. And we know that, you know, there are many things that we're asking our floor staff to do, not only working with young people, but there's, you know, data entries, the reports. There are many, many, many different things that we're asking them to do. Take them, you know, take the young people out for, you know, medical services, emergency services, support. And so we asked them to do a study and to help us understand, you know, are we asking staff to do too much, and what are some of the things that they're finding in terms of their review of our detention program. And clearly they found that one of the things that we really need to deal with is the stress and burnout of our staff. Again, you know, when you have a high turnover, you don't have a stable workforce, you don't have an effective team. It just, you know, one thing after another, and it's starting to spiral. So one of the recommendations that came out of this study and internal discussions within the organization was really to think about changing the work schedule for folks who are working in our 24/7 facilities. And so we're hoping that by changing from a 3-shift, 8-hour work, you know, 5 days a week work schedule to a 4-day, 10-hour-a-day schedule, that we'll be able to reverse some of these negative factors that are impacting our workforce. So we're hoping through the 4-day work week that we would figure out a way to improve job satisfaction and morale, retention, more time for supervision and job coaching, more time for floor staff to communicate with their supervisors and vice versa, reduce overtime and absenteeism, cut down on industrial accidents, improve, which is really critical, the youth and staff relationship, and you know, have an impact on some of the risk indicators. Next slide. So here you see really is the 4 10-hour day and 3 days off work schedule that was developed for our pilot program, which we implemented a little over a year ago. And as you can see, what this has enabled us to do is to have more staff on the floor at critical times without having to hire more staff. So with the same number of staff, we're able to change their schedule so that we have more staff during the critical times that we saw from our data where incidents occur and where there is a lot more movement of young people within our facilities. So you can see, like, for example, so the first shift now is 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. And that's really a very busy time when we're getting young people ready to get up, go to school, then they're done with school, and then have you know, some free time before dinner. And so if you look at, like, any of these days, even like on a Wednesday, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 staff on the floor. Whereas, you know, if we didn't have this 4-day on 3 days off schedule, we would have 4 staff on the floor. And what does that mean? So, one, you have more staff that can provide more attention to the young people. 2, in our traditional 5-day schedule 8-hour shifts. Whenever there's a shift change, we have to have the young people taken back into the room in order to have the shift change, in order for staff to be able to communicate with one another during the shift change. This is not the case in this particular flexible schedule, because now we have enough staff for the staff to engage the youth in different activities without the youth having to go into their rooms. And there's enough time for communication between supervisors and our floor staff to take, to occur without, again, taking staff away from spending time with the young people. So this is an example I think is really positive in the sense that it really goes to address the concern around having enough staff around and reducing and improve and expanding amount of time that staff have with the young people while they're working. So next slide. So here are some of the comments that we have gotten from staff about the new schedule. As you can see, forced overtime is really not an issue because of the overlap. We don't, if someone needs to stay later, it usually could be for 1 or 2 hours because they know someone else will show up, as opposed to when we had the traditional 8-hour shifts. And again, they say, extra staff really does make a difference in terms of being able to engage young people more directly and more often on a one-to-one basis. Next slide. Again, talks about having the opportunity to get to know the young people better, having more quality time with supervisors, and getting the on-the-job coaching and one-to-one discussions and communication amongst the team, which is really important. Next slide. Interesting enough, we also had asked the youth how they felt about this change in the schedule. Now, understand some of these youth have been in other programs where there's the traditional 3 shifts, 8 hours each. And interesting enough, comments were that they felt more comfortable and more safe, which was something that was totally unexpected in terms of hearing that. It was very gratifying to hear that. In fact, the young people are also feeling very positive about this change in the way that we're scheduling staff. So next slide. So again, this really just gives you a visual in terms of the staff and what they think about the 4-day work week. Again, they talk about they like the reduced mandatory overtime. They would like to see expanded to other programs. So generally, as you can see with the blue bars, it's been pretty positive. Next slide. Again, here we have, we had done a survey of staff after about a year to just get their input in terms of what they thought about the program. And so many of them would say they would recommend it to others. They think it really promotes teamwork, good communication, and they feel like they have more opportunity to really feel valued and really contribute in terms of how the program and the unit is run. And they really feel like they're part of a team. And I think that has a lot to do with, fewer required for overtime, less absenteeism, better communication, a stable workforce, and so a stronger team. Next slide. So what are some of the advantages of the 4-day work week? So again, it talks about more on-the-job training and supervision. There's more staff. Also important, better work-life balance. That was very key in terms of the feedback that we heard. People felt really great that they had 3 consecutive days off, so that even if they had to come in for an extra day and only had 2 days off, it was less of an onus for them, because they felt, with 3 days off, they felt refreshed coming back to the unit. Less commuting time, so less time, on the road getting to the job. And of course, they all really do like 3 consecutive days off. Next slide. So again, this talks about some of the other metrics that we're looking at, and so we compared it to 2 other programs, detention programs that are also housed in the same building as the Suffolk program, which is the 4-day, 3-day off program. And as you can see, tardiness, really not a problem, and shift change was not a problem either. So it really, these are very positive metrics that we're getting out of studying the 4-day work week. Next slide. Again, this one shows the difference that we try to compare with the 3 programs. Again, we have the 3 detention programs. As you can see in the red, the involuntary overtime for the Suffolk detention, the last metric was taken back in August, is minuscule compared to some of the other programs. So that is definitely having a very positive impact on our workforce, that they're not getting forced overtime. Next slide. We also thought it was important that we do something very tangible in terms of recognition and appreciation of the work that our staff does. They, I know, feel appreciated by young people who often come back and call them and thank them for what they've done in terms of helping them. But we thought it was important in terms of management being able to do that. So a few years back, we initiated our annual Years of Service Awards, and really is to acknowledge the commitment that our staff have made in terms of doing this work for the period of time that they've done. And we have employees that just recently celebrated their 35th year with us. But we also, what we've done with this event is to publicly acknowledge and recognize those new employees who have made it past their first year, because I think that was really important to really tell them that we appreciate them joining the team and making it through the first year, which is really the toughest one, where new employees will shortly realize whether this is the right work or not the right work for them. So that was really important. I think that the new employees are very appreciative of being recognized in that way and knowing that they are very much part of our team. We also have our annual Commissioners Awards, and that really is a way to recognize and show our appreciation and celebrate those employees that have made a significant contribution to the work of our agency. And what's really great about this is that the nominations are made by 3 groups of people. So we have state employees nominating state employees, state and providers employees nominating our providers employees, and then 2 years ago we also added the youth voice. So now young people in the programs are also nominating staff for recognition. And it's a great event. We, have special speakers and special awards that we give to our staff during the annual Commissioners Awards. Next slide. Lastly, we have our post-holiday decoration, and this is a way of engaging our staff in terms of a contest. So every December now we have a contest where people will be asked to decorate their offices, both in terms of staff as well as young people, and working together as well. And we have a contest that then everyone in our service system, both provider and state employees, get to vote, and we do the voting through our intranet site. And then we give them a great reward, and people have been very, very, very good about it. We have a one trophy that goes from site to site depending upon who wins, and that's something that each program covets to get the following year. So it's been really good in terms of just creating, good team spirit amongst all our employees. Next slide. Many of you probably are familiar with performance-based standards, but it's a way of collecting data around how we're doing in our programs. And there is this climate survey that's included in PBS, and we ask staff questions such as, how safe they feel, whether they receive enough training, do they get enough information to perform their job, do I know what my job expectations are, am I satisfied with my job, do I feel like I get heard in terms of any input in the development of any treatment plan or programming that goes on. And I have to say that, we've been pretty pleased with some of the results of these surveys. They're generally pretty positive, but again, it's helpful because there are certainly areas for improvement that we've noted. And this is something that we do every year through PBS, and it's another source of information that is very helpful in terms of guiding us in things that we can do better. Next slide. So the next several slides are really some of the risk indicators. And again, these slides, these data are reviewed not only at our regular safety committee meetings, but it's reviewed at our senior staff meetings. And all our senior staff review it with their program staff as well. So staff realize that we're looking at these metrics because it really tells us a number of things in terms of how well are we doing in terms of the safety and quality of the program. When restraints are going down, we know that in fact things that we're doing must be having an impact, a positive impact on the young people. If restraints are going down, we would conclude that the trusting relationship between staff and the young person is working, that our use of DBT is working. So it really is encouraging to see the trend line going down in terms of restraint. Similarly, next slide, we look at the room confinement, and again, that trend is also going down. We review it at all different levels, and again, it tells us that we must be doing some of the things right because these are trending in the right direction. Next slide. So again, similarly with assaults, it's going down. And as I said before, beyond these numbers, we have now conducted a post-assault study to help us look at the triggers that are causing these behaviors, and we'll be working on strategies on how to leverage what we learned from that study into practice. Next slide. So this one is talking about safety and industrial accidents. So again, the cost of staff injury to a program is significant, not only in terms of having to get more staff, causing forced overtime in a program, and the financial cost of people being out, financial and psychological costs of people being out because they've been injured on the job. And so, as you can see, we're really pleased that, in fact, we've made tremendous strides in terms of reducing the amount of time that staff are out of work because of injuries on the job, and that has been really significant. And I think that's made a difference in terms of how the programs operate, because they know that person might be out hurt, but they'll be back soon, as opposed to when things were not going well, we often wonder whether someone is staying out longer than they need to because they don't want to go back to work. So this is a really positive indicator. And last but not least, next slide, we have done a lot of work in terms of addressing staff turnover with all the different strategies. and initiatives that I talked about earlier, we've been able to significantly reduce our turnover of staff, as you can see from this slide. And that's it, and I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
Well, thank you, Margaret. I appreciate it. There's a lot of good information there, and some of the things that I'll talk about will reference some of your slides. But everybody knows that the turnover costs a lot of money. So I came across this statistic that's on the slide there, and it really finally gave some hard numbers to how much it actually costs. And I don't know how actually true that is, but no matter how you slice it, it's still expensive. Next slide, please. Several years ago, the late Susan Taylor from SMT Associates in Louisiana referred me to a book by Mac Anderson. And it was pretty simple. You can't send a duck to Eagle School. So I think one of the most important things we can do is to hire the right people for the right job. And hiring the wrong people just simply leads to turnover, dissatisfaction on the employee's part, dissatisfaction on the employer's part. So that selection is ultimately the most important thing, I think, to start a good, to keep somebody for a long time. So anyway, I was pleased to be asked to participate in the webinar and share some of the things I've learned in the 26 years that I've been the director here. Next slide, please. So our testing has been refined over the years, and to the point we're pretty satisfied with the results. Now, I'm not going to be able to add anything technical or real fancy to the process, but just some of the things that we've come across over the years to help us choose the right people. We have our initial testing, which consists of physical testing and also the ergometrics impact testing. We'll speak more about ergometrics in just a few minutes, but we have first interview after that and second interview, and then even a third interview for giving the person the job offer. Now, next slide, please. Our formal scoring process for all applicants actually starts before they show up for their initial testing. We send out this invitation and give them some direction. We give them, of course, the date and time. We give them instructions on how to dress and what they'll be doing during that initial testing. Tell them to bring necessary paperwork, and then we also simply ask for them to confirm their initial testing. So if they confirm, they get points. If they don't get points. If they show up for our physical testing in a suit and tie, oh well. If they don't bring the paperwork, we also document that. So we start testing them before they show up. Next slide, please. The ergometrics, next slide, sorry about that. The ergometrics testing that we used, I think is really important in our selection process. About 15 years ago, I first became acquainted with ergometrics during a presentation at a conference. In Idaho, our standards for juvenile detention certification required an aptitude test, but no one was actually sure what that actually meant. So upon hearing the impact presentation, I contacted them and we started using it in our detention center. They validated their test for a number of different positions in a correctional facility, and it evaluates each applicant in several different categories, which is what you're seeing on the right hand of that slide. Next slide. Impact has some goals, and you can find this on the impact.org, or excuse me, ergometrics.org website, but it really is designed to select the top candidate, those who have an aptitude for working with kids. And my comment under the disadvantages is kind of meant to be humorous, but it's loosely based on an actual experience. Somebody that knew a lot of people that worked here, including myself, applied to be hired here, and they did not pass the ergometrics or the impact testing. And so it was easy for us to show them why they were not considered for employment. One of the other things that I think is important is the last one, the last bullet point. Our experience is that after someone has gone through the initial testing, and when we send them an invitation to come back for their first interview, we rarely have no-shows to the first interview. We bring in an experienced interview panel, and we've all been through interview panels where we sit around watching the clock for the next interview because somebody didn't show up. So it's a monumental waste of money and resources, but the way we've structured our process, we have gotten the no-shows down to almost zero. About 3 years ago, I did have somebody not come to their appointment. They did show up the next day. They weren't allowed to test. They weren't allowed to interview. They've already showed me that they couldn't follow instructions, so they were not considered. Next slide, please. This one, along with the next slide that we'll see in a second, shows the 9 different categories that are evaluated by the impact testing. As you look through some of the points, you'll see traits that, at least I think, they're important in good officers or care workers. So next slide, please. I strongly recommend looking into ergometrics for their impact testing. They have some different price structures. I can't speak to that. I don't have authority to speak on behalf of ergometrics, but I really believe that this is the most cost-effective way that we have found to select the right people for jobs here in juvenile detention. So, next slide, please. All the applicants who have satisfactorily completed the physical testing and the ergometrics testing are sent an invitation to appear for their first interview. The information on the invitation includes, of course, the time and the instructions to arrive 15 minutes early. Again, bring any paperwork and also to confirm their appointment. Again, we score the applicants. If they confirm, they get points. If they show up on time, they get points. Next slide. One of the instructions in the previous slide, that they're to show up 15 minutes early, is really important because during that 15 minutes, they're actually given a test. The minute the applicant arrives and checks in with the receptionist, they're given a hypothetical situation. It's 1 page, front and back, with separate questions on each side of the paper. If they happen to arrive 5 minutes early, before their appointed time, they're only allowed 5 minutes to complete the test. The paper is attached to a clipboard, and the page that is showing clearly is labeled page 1. I've been very surprised and, in a lot of cases, disappointed at the number of applicants who do not turn the page over to see if there's a page 2. We all want to hire people who are thorough and accurate in all that they do, and this simple exercise, I think, reveals a weakness that, if they are hired, it may be something that you'll have to address later. Next slide, please. The first interview it's very simple. They are scripted. We use an interview panel consisting of supervisors and also line staff. The interview consists of 16 questions, and everybody gets the exact same amount of time to answer the questions. No other information is given during the question period, such as elaborating on policy or practice or anything like that. Some of the questions that we use come up again in the second interview. Referring back to one of the slides that Margaret talked about, sometimes they don't understand exactly what a juvenile detention officer does. So one of our questions is simply, tell us in your own words what you think a juvenile detention officer does. And we've been surprised about some of the answers, which I'm sure you would be. Another question we ask is, what is your knowledge of the Idaho Juvenile Corrections Act of 1995? And in most cases, the answer is, I do not know. That comes up again in the second interview as well. Next slide. We also use a typing test, and there's a lot of ways you can do it. I just don't want to pay one person 3 hours of overtime to type a report that their fellow employee was able to do in 30 minutes. So I want to hire people that know how to type. And you can use the online typing tests, or our State Department of Labor conducts them, and they also check identification before they do the test. We used to let the applicants do the test at home and bring them in, but I'm pretty sure that over the years we found out how fast their spouses can type, not the applicant themselves. Next slide. The next step is a second interview, and they are done every 45 minutes. There's a little bit more time. And again, we send out invitations with instructions, and again, they're graded on those, their ability to follow instructions. The second interviews are much less formal. The interview panel can ask questions. The applicant can ask questions. The interview panel can ask about any information on the application or some of the answers during the first interview. It's during the second interview we ask again, what is your knowledge of the Idaho Juvenile Corrections Act of 1995? And you'd be surprised how many people have not even gone home to look it up, and they still don't have an idea. And we also discuss what a juvenile detention officer does during this second interview. It's during the second interview also that we can take the applicants on a quick tour and answer questions as well. Next slide. The third time that we have them back, for the third interview, excuse me, they are given a conditional job offer, and at that point we can proceed with any background checks, child abuse registry checks, everything like that. Next slide, please. So finally, after everybody's done all their pre-hire work, you bring the applicant on board and start to train them. And our training program lasts approximately 15 weeks, and this may seem like a long period, and I have had other administrators of small detention centers tell me that they just can't afford a program that long. My viewpoint is that you can't afford not to have a program that long. Ours is set up, some of it looks like the process that Margaret instructed us on earlier. We have the first 3 weeks involving mostly classroom instructions, and then they are assigned to field training officers, and they will do 1 month on nights and 2 months on days. We don't have the luxury of having so many state academies as Massachusetts does. We only have a couple each year. And so at some point during their first year, they will attend the 3-week academy at our post academy. Next slide. I brag a little bit. Our training program was recognized by the American Correctional Association in their Corrections Today magazine in June 2010 as being one of the best in the business. So, next slide. Our field training officer program is basically patterned after some of the widely recognized law enforcement FDO programs like Kaminsky. The program includes clear and easy to understand standard performance guidelines that are reviewed with the trainee. They get daily feedback and critique through the daily training reports. And I think this covers some of those seven deadly sins of management that were on one of the slides earlier in the webinar. The FTO program is also designed to fill out the post-mandated field training manual, and that's completed by the FTO and the trainee. All of this training, daily reports, standard performance guidelines, creates a mound of paperwork documenting the employee's entire training program. However, this can really work in your favor if later on the employee acts outside of the scope of the training and job description and you need to terminate them. You will have all of the paperwork, all of the ammunition, so to speak, that you'll need to terminate a person when you meet with your HR department, and can show this meticulous and well-documented training that you've provided. One experience about 3 years ago happened when a terminated former employee filed a complaint with the Idaho Human Rights Commission. I furnished them with all of the training records and everything that we've done during the FTO program. And the Human Rights Commission actually called our attorney and canceled the next hearing. So I think it's essential to have this documentation. Next slide, please. I really believe that it's important to train past basic knowledge, and I want my employees to be able to not simply recite steps or techniques that they need to use, but be able to understand the background and some of the reasons why we do that. For example, instead of just training on how to use appropriate use of force, we also train on the 4th, the 8th, and the 14th Amendments, as well as the Graham versus Connor reasonableness test, which all may come into play when use of force incidents are scrutinized. We also train the background of why we have certain policies and procedures, including state standards, federal law, case law, and things like that. Next slide, please. I found this article on the Robert Half blog, and dealing with effective employee retention strategies. And Margaret went over several really neat programs that they use in Massachusetts. I feel that our field training officer program is real strong on a lot of these things that this blog listed. The field training program is strong on mentorship, training and development, communication and feedback, fostering teamwork. So I feel that program is really good with meeting the needs of the new employee. Also, we have some other things. I'll just briefly mention just one of them. We have an annual offsite training. We use the local parks to hold the training, and we build teamwork through various exercises, including ropes courses and problem solving. So I believe if the employee recognizes the amount of time and effort that you're investing in them, you'll build loyalty in that officer. My facility is 78 beds. Our average population right now is 30 kids, and we employ about 35 to 40 juvenile detention officers. Over the past 15 years, I've hired 85 officers. The average tenure of my present employees is 9.98 years. I have 6 employees that have been with the department for 20 years or more. And in a lot of cases, people that leave for some reason or another will ask to stay on the part-time list because of the culture, and I think it's very good. Next slide, please. One of the things that early in my career, I went through the course called Leadership Challenge, and I asked all my people to use these concepts to challenge our process, even from the newest employee to the most tenured veteran. Look at what we're doing and see if there's a better way to do it. Come up with things that they think will work, and we'll try them. And as a result, a lot of our programs have come from the staff, and I think it's made us a safer facility. In 2017, we had 3 use of force incidents. In 2018, we had a little bit more, we had 12. But I really believe that allowing the officers to come up with programs, it strengthens their authorship in the program, the objectives of the facility, and I believe they stay longer. The last slide really sums up my viewpoint of leadership. Next slide, please. You've hired good people, you've trained them well. Now get out of their way, let them do their job. And I will turn the time back to Sharon, I believe.
Actually,
Wendy,
Wendy, do you want to close us out?
Yes, I will. Thank you, Steve. Unfortunately, we're out of time for the webinar. However, for those of you who have submitted questions, we will respond to you via email. So I'd just like to take this time to thank our presenters and all of our participants on today's webinar for taking time to work and listen in on this important issue. I'd like to encourage everyone to attend our next webinar on the role of staff wellness and retention, which is scheduled to be held on Tuesday, September 10th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Also, please note that today's webinar will be posted on the CJCA website. And lastly, there will be a short survey for you to take upon closing out the application. Please be sure to complete the survey so we can use your feedback to improve on our future webinars. Have a great day. Bye-bye.